Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture. Time for our new weekly segment, Foul Play, where we run the tape of the best and the worst in global sports. I'm Bob Schlick. We're here with Michelle Whitty. Michelle, I'm pretty excited for this new segment. We're going to, for now, bench our previous weekly Wednesday segment, Avert Your Eyes, our political ad segment. More than happy to switch it out for some sports talk. Joining us this week for Foul Play is founder and executive director Hoops Sagrado, Bryan Weaver, and Nate Wallace, the creator and co-host of the podcast Redspin Sports. Nate and Bryan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I hope you guys like the Foul Play reference there. I'm pretty excited for it. Michelle Whitty gets all the credit for the
absolutely
naming of the new title. Getting into it here. Nate, let me start with you, Nate Wallace, Redspin Sports here. The biggest story of today, I guess, is the National Football League teams, Baltimore Ravens and the Pittsburgh Steelers, playing today, Wednesday, at 3:40 p.m. I mean, I'm not a historian of the NFL, but I will go out on a limb and say this is the first time ever an NFL game started at 3:40 p.m. on a Wednesday. The game has already been pushed back 3 times, first from Thanksgiving last week to last Sunday, then from Sunday to Tuesday night, and then from Tuesday to Wednesday. The Ravens had more than a dozen players on reserve COVID-19 list as of Tuesday afternoon, a group that includes reigning NFL MVP Lamar Jackson. The Steelers have COVID-19 issues of their own, with defensive end Stephen Tuitt and starting running back James Conner among the 4 players who will not play. So, Nate, I'm curious what you make of this game. It seems absolutely absurd that they're even playing it, that they didn't just cancel it. But if you could tell us a little bit more about the precarious situation NFL players find themselves in if these games were to simply be canceled.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you define by precarious. I mean, there's the whole issue of, like, if they're not played, they're not going to get paid. There's the issue of the TV contracts, then, you know, how that revenue kicks in. If those games aren't played, the owners don't get paid. Therefore, it could be used as a weapon to say that, like, you know, the players are, you know, hurting league revenue, therefore, you know, forcing them to take, cuts maybe down the road. There's the issue, too, the NFL not being flexible about an 18-week. I mean, the owners have talked about the idea of pushing the playoffs back to the 18th week, but they have been very, you know, reluctant to do that. You've had this game was supposed to be played literally like on Thanksgiving Day. So we're talking like 6 days later. They're going to be condensing more games into this, you know, time going into next week too. I think the Steelers will be playing on Tuesday. It's highly irregular. I mean, it's bizarre. And I think one thing that needs to be pointed out in all this is the larger question beyond just like Lamar Jackson not being able to play, beyond the issues the Ravens have really had in terms of having to, you know, push this game back more, and not being comfortable with it, you know, even being on Tuesday, is that, you know, the amount of resources that are being expended in terms of testing and tracing and whatnot that is happening in the NFL, that's not happening in other aspects and other places in society. And it just sort of is a great, like, illustration of, like, what happens in not just within capitalist sport in this country, but just within the society that's, like, you know, predicated off, you know, big capital and putting on spectacle, that, you know, these games have to go on to give the, you know, the at least the perception of normality, to give people this idea and it's something to invest meaning into. And but it's something crazy when you don't have this widespread access to testing on a total social level. Yeah. We talked about and all the propaganda against China, and yet they have Stephon Marbury explain their systems and how, quite frankly, superior they are to what goes on in the U.S. So there's a lot of ways you can go at it with this.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I'm waiting for like the vaccine order of who gets the vaccine. It should be like healthcare workers, seniors in senior center workers, and then sports athletes. That will be the way in which we roll out the vaccine. But
it totally makes sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely crazy. Bryan Weaver, Robert Griffin III, the former Heisman Trophy winner for the Baylor Bears and former Washington Football Club legend, will be making the start today. So I got a 2-part question for you, Bryan. Are you going to be tuning in to watch the game? And second, is it time for people who are boycotting the league in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick to begin watching football again if they wish to do so?
I'm excited for Bobby Three Sticks. I think this is, you know, I think a lot of people who followed Washington football, you know, just really had left a whole bitter taste in their mouth, how that all ended. But 2012 was kind of a magical season, I think, for DC football. And I wish nothing but best for Robert Griffin, and I hope he actually does well in the game. I'll probably just out of morbid curiosity, just because it's so weird to have so many players not be out there. And I just sort of think this is like kind of turning into NASCAR for the car crash. Morbid curiosity, I'll probably turn it in a little bit. As for people who are taking a principled stance of not watching it because of Colin Kaepernick still hasn't been signed. And a lot of it took essentially like civil action by a majority of people in the United States to actually get the NFL to sort of change some policies and sort of acknowledge that there were some problems inherent within the organization. I don't know. Like, it'll be hard for me. I was never like 100% in on the banning the NFL. Like I'm not boycotting the NFL, but like the magic's kind of gone for me a little bit. Like I can take it or leave it. And I think COVID and how they've reacted has kind of made me like even sense that a little bit more, because I mean the financial means of this are just very different than, let's say, how the NBA did theirs. I mean, I think the players and ownership definitely have like a more sort of cohesive sort of working together structure. And I still sort of feel that the NFL kind of has like a Maggie's Farm kind of mentality about how they put their product on the field.
Yeah. A mess there in the NFL. And Nate, I'm a huge hypocrite on this one as someone who watches a lot of baseball and a lot of very conservatively owned Chicago Cubs, but I do not think people should be watching the NFL, both in solidarity with Kaepernick and that it is such a violent and abusive sport. I also struggle with the sports fans, and it's not just the NFL, it's all U.S. sports, but I still can't get over that first NFL game this year between the Texans and Kansas City, where the players took a moment of silence for unity at center field, and the fans, the few fans that were in the stage, audibly booed. So, sports is kind of this double-edged sword in the United States. Great gathering point, great way to build community and to connect people. But at the same time, it really also promotes some of the really bad things like toxic masculinity and the U.S. military and the really bad parts of nationalism all wrapped into one. It just makes it really kind of a complex landscape for sports here in the United States.
No, it's funny what you said about baseball, because I'm being called me complicit or whatever. I'm a huge baseball fan too. And kind of for the fact that it's like, antithetical to football. I mean, I have a hard time tuning away from football. I have a love-hate relationship. I mean, it's definitely taken a huge toll on my life, but it's also been a huge source of like meaning. I don't know if I wouldn't have had the cross-class relationships, the insight, the experiences that I had learning about the reality of life for my fellow, mainly where I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and Black brothers I played ball with and their families and whatnot, and what they were going through, and really being able to juxtapose that with like the BS reality that a lot of my classmates were going through in school, and how they, wanted to, in a very classist way, wall themselves off from that. Well, going to the football thing, it's just so full of contradictions. I mean, because you have not just the fans that can afford to go to games are like that, but then you have in so many oppressed communities, the condition of capitalism creates a system that breeds alienation. It also is inherently violent, a system that can go and rip people up from their homes, especially during a pandemic. It kind of lays that bare. And there's and the violence that's like underneath all that is the reality of like, people having to, fight it out dog eat dog for a finite amount of resources. And like football is really like, and same with MMA and other combat sports are kind of like, it's why proletarian, kind of like oppressed people, really relate to it. I feel like that it's a metaphor for the lived life experience. In terms of Kaepernick, and it's weird. The boycott thing is one thing, but you also even when that was going on, I draw the line at buying a bunch of gear basically for the NFL. I mean, people can pirate stuff, whatever. I mean, I want to support players that are trying to do and make stands within, and try to stay informed at least. So, I mean, I'm going to watch. I'm dubious of consumer activism sometimes, but yeah, I'm not going to also go out and promote it as if it's uncritically the greatest thing ever. So,
sure.
A little contradictory response, I guess.
Yeah. And Nate, I just want to let you know, I'm wearing my Chicago Cubs hat in response to the video I saw you with Danny Haifung in your Florida Marlins cap. We did lose you in the playoffs, so I'll have to be I don't want to be a sore loser, but I'm repping the team right now. Michelle, you said you're going to tune into the game later on today. What are your thoughts there on sports and boycotts?
Yeah, I mean, I miss football, and my boycott is really, I mean, I sort of, curtailed watching a little bit, not specifically about Colin Kaepernick years ago, but just about the traumatic brain injury and just the amount of money people were making on taking this toll. But on taking this toll on the players' bodies. But I will say, I think we talk really sort of casually and in sort of moralistic terms about refusing to watch these different sports. But I have to say, we don't talk about boycotting dance, for example, which is another, a human endeavor that takes a very serious toll on people's bodies. That is ultimately meaningless and sort of ephemeral and exists to demonstrate to us what human beings are capable of, in terms of artistry, in terms of passion, in terms of ability, and which also makes not the dancers, not the participants, a lot of money. And I don't see people saying, oh, well, we should boycott ballet, we should boycott whatever. So, I think that, it's very easy to kind of take a moral position on sports that doesn't necessarily hold up when you try to apply the same principles across the board. So, if you want to watch sports, Bryan, I figure it's okay.
Thank you. I think the nationalism thing is kind of an interesting argument, Bob, because I'm a basketball person, and so my nonprofit is based around sort of building bridges between different cultures and races, using basketball as that tool. And I think the NBA showed something very, very different this year. I think that the whole idea of the back of the jerseys, the messages that you wanted to pass along, Black Lives Matter being put at each of the baselines, the players actually putting money up for various different causes, having white European players write Black Lives Matter in their native languages on the backs of their jerseys. I think that football in its nature and in its core has aspects of that always has sort of been there underneath that sort of nationalistic sort of tone. I think that if you think about where basketball is popular and where you think of football being popular, they're kind of different parts of the country. And so I think it's too easy for us to sort of, throw that it brings up the worst sort of elements of nationalism. I think it probably more reflects the division of the country at the moment.
Yeah, I think I'm also being a little biased towards the last game I went to was a Chicago Cubs game at Wrigley Field. I sat on the bleachers. We happened to be there on Military Appreciation Night. And before the game, they had different members of the military branches take different positions on the field with a military jet flyover. And in that situation, Bryan, it felt more like a war rally or a nationalistic rally that happened to have a baseball game after it. So it is really amazing. I think that's shows my hypocrisy. I think of all the sports, baseball might be the worst of all of the sports, the one I still watch. So I don't hold anything against people that watch the NFL. But in those situations, you do see kind of the hyper nationalism. I wanted to also get your thoughts here, Nate, on the continuation of protests within sports, and if we'll continue to see sports athletes do some type of protest that we saw in the NBA earlier this year. And I'm critical of it because I obviously do not think that voting was more important, unlike what Barack Obama thought, than the boycott that the NBA players did. But that was around racial justice issues. We've seen labor strikes in the past, but I want to kind of also bring in the death of Diego Maradona last week and how he also was a champion for economic inequality and even speaking up and calling out the Pope at one point so famously, that there isn't necessarily a loud voice when it comes to labor within sports that I think is also a potential for there to be a greater movement in the labor movement writ large in this country if sports athletes wanted to speak up.
Right, no doubt. So, just to use the NBA thing real quick, it's clear they're going to allow, it's great that Black Lives Matter was on the jerseys you had, and I love basketball. Basketball is a huge part of my life too. And I hear what you're saying. It is true what Bryan was saying with about the NBA owned players and owners having a closer relationship. I think part of that to do with the rosters being a little smaller too, and you don't have just such a huge revolving door. It's not quite as many people, but there's also other reasons for that. It's a different sector of capital maybe that owns NBA teams, even though they're quite reactionary on their own. There's the billionaires, but there's also the issue of you're not going to have someone with a free. NBA is not allowing anybody to put Free Palestine on the back of their jerseys, or they're not going to allow people to say labor solidarity messages on the back of their jerseys. And there's a reason for that. We know it's sort of you can wrap up the idea of voting and the idea of identity into something that the neoliberal state and the corporate apparatus that sort of, benefits from the state policy that enables it, is okay with. They feel like they can control that kind of messaging. But once you start getting that class sort of antagonism, it becomes a different thing, which is exactly why Diego Maradona is being character assassinated posthumously. I mean, this guy is a people's champ, and objectively, and granted, on a personal level, he had his issues. I mean, how many people in this country have had issues with cocaine, have had issues with, all sorts of things? I mean, this guy had so many siblings growing up that he was taken care of from like such a young age. He went to Italy, turned down huge amounts of money in coaching to coach like a working class like club in Naples, as opposed to going up to the wealthy northern Italian team clubs that are so wealthy. He's despised in the Italian media as a result. The U.S. media has just spit on him basically about his relationship with Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, and his strong support of building international solidarity and being a staunch anti-imperialist. So while he, people in fame and the kind of just meteoric fame, like international fame he experienced, it's not a surprise they experience kind of personal problems in their life that end up being masked with substance abuse. And it's just ironic that kind of treatment where people are painted sympathetically, to deal with substance abuse from, middle class or upper middle class or super wealthy people dealing with it. It's like with Diego Maradona, it's like major thing we have to really look at and examine his legacy and whatnot, and really kind of drudge through all the negative stuff. And it's not that there's not any there. It's just that I think it's clearly selective, and it's a chance to try to smear someone as not being worthy of like the people's champ status they deserve, which he clearly does, in my opinion.
Bryan Weaver, I'm curious your thoughts on that same conversation.
No, I think it's kind of interesting. So having most of my professional work happening in Central America, I think I probably see Maradona like in two different lights. One, I just think that the United States, as much as like soccer has become the sport of little kids and middle schoolers, we still just don't really have a very particularly good embrace of the global game. And it's very sort of rudimentary. Like people will probably know like the three biggest stars in the world, add on Maradona and Pele, maybe, and that might be it. So I sort of think when the American media or when like American talking heads are talking about the legacy of Maradona, I think it comes from that American perspective. So I kind of view that it's ignorant from the beginning. I think that lots of seam heads probably understand it differently, and some of them have definitely had some things about, that have talked about Maradona, but it has more to do with sort of the TMZ lifestyle that he lived at times, like firing the pellet gun at reporters and things like that. He's going to be remembered for being, one of, if not the greatest soccer player of all time. And I think that that World Club Championship is going to be something that's going to be remembered forever. Here in the States, we only really remember the hand of God line. But like I think globally, I think it's going to be viewed very differently. And I think that even people, the same way that I think that Kobe Bryant was probably sort of looked in one lens and then came out on the other side that's different. I think the same thing is going to happen with Maradona. People may have been like, "Oh, he's pompous," he's puts himself in front of the team. But then, in retrospect, people are going to look back and be like, "What we actually got to witness was something amazing, something magical." And I think that that's going to ultimately be his legacy. But I just don't think that for most American audiences that they really understand like what they were seeing.
Yeah, no, it was fascinating. There, speaking of the Pope, there, the NBA players and a few of the Players Association meeting with the Pope, I think just a few weeks ago there, Nate, at the Vatican. So we got to get out of here. Bryan Weaver, let me first just ask you as we head out, where can people go to find more about Hoops Sagrado? And tell us a little bit more about the work. I just think it's so vital, not only what you do with the programming, but the ways in which you stay in these young people's lives well after.
Yeah, there's kind of two sections to the program. One is trying to foster connections and bridges in Mayan communities in Guatemala and in southern Mexico. We use basketball as that tool. And then the second part is giving young people of color the opportunity to like go and travel and see the world in ways that aren't sort of paternalistic, in ways that like it's sort of like their own trip. We've had a lot of kids that have gone on to the university, and sadly we've had a lot of kids who've gone on to the penitentiary. And the most important thing I think is for us is to just try to like stand with them in those aspects of life. And that's something that I think whether it's in Guatemala or whether it's in Southeast D.C., they just need more people in their lives that are willing to sort of stand with them, the margins, and have the margins change the volunteers, not the kids that are standing there. And that's kind of at the core of what our program is. If people want to learn more about us, you can go to Hoops, Hoops, Sagrado, Sagrado.org.
Very cool. And Nate Wallace, you're the creator and co-host of the podcast Redspin Sports. Where can people go to find more Redspin Sports?
Yeah, so we're on Patreon now. I'm trying to build that up a little bit more to get more stuff coming out regularly. The YouTube channel, and now just pretty much wherever you listen to your podcast. And I'm on weekly every Friday with Sean and Jackie on By Any Means Necessary too, and just kind of whenever we can get stuff out. But yeah, I know, and I wanted to say one thing real quick to Michelle is that the cheer stuff, I suspect she's watched the Netflix series a little bit, Cheer, that a lot of people have gotten into, because there's definitely a lot to chew on with that, and maybe that'll be another topic some other day.
All right, cool. Let's do it.
All right, we'll have you back soon. Nate Wallace of Redspin Sports, Bryan Weaver of Hoops Sagrado. Bryan, Nate, thank you so much for joining us. That was our weekly segment, Follow Play, where we run the tape of the best and worst in global sports. With that, we turn to one last break. Political Misfits, Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.